On May 8, 1945, London sounded like a city that had survived the end of the world. Crowds packed the streets, church bells rang. People climbed onto statues, waved flags, and shouted Winston Churchill's name. Nazi Germany was defeated. Europe's long nightmare appeared to be over. But Churchill was not looking only at the cheering crowds. He was looking east. Beyond the ruined streets of Berlin stood the largest army on the continent. The Red Army had suffered losses almost beyond imagination, then fought its way from the Soviet Union into the heart of Germany. Its soldiers had helped destroy Hitler's regime, and no honest account of the war could deny their sacrifice. Yet those same soldiers now occupied a vast stretch of Europe, from the Baltic region in the north to the Balkans in the south. For Churchill, victory had created a new and dangerous question. What happened when the enemy that held the Allies together no longer existed? Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had never been natural partners. They had become allies because Hitler threatened them all. Churchill had spent much of his political life opposing communism, while Joseph Stalin deeply distrusted the Western powers. During the war, both men pushed those differences aside because the German threat was greater. Now, Germany was beaten, and the old distrust returned almost overnight. The main pressure point was Poland. Britain had entered the war in 1939 after Germany invaded Poland. Polish pilots had fought in the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers had fought in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. Polish sailors had served at sea beside the Royal Navy. After 6 years of war, Poland was not a small side issue to Churchill. It was tied to the reason Britain had gone to war in the first place. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allied leaders agreed that Poland would receive a broader government and eventually hold free elections. On paper, that sounded like a path toward independence. On the ground, Churchill feared something very different was happening. Soviet forces controlled the country. A Soviet-backed Polish government held the advantage. Non-communist Polish leaders had little power, and Western officials struggled to learn what was happening inside areas under Soviet control. The farther the Red Army advanced, the harder it became for Britain or the United States to influence events. Churchill saw the danger clearly. Poland might be freed from Nazi occupation only to lose its freedom under another great power. And Poland was only the beginning. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and much of Eastern Europe were now under the shadow of Soviet military strength. Western armies had also advanced deep into Germany, but many of those troops would soon move back to their agreed occupation zones. American forces were already needed for the continuing war against Japan. British soldiers had been away from home for years, and the public wanted them back. Time was moving quickly in Stalin's favor. Churchill's fear was not simply about ideology. It was about the balance of power. The Soviet Union had earned a seat among the victors, but its armies were now standing far beyond its pre-war borders. If those positions became permanent political control, Britain could emerge from the war weaker. Europe could be divided, and the promises made to smaller nations could depend on whether Stalin chose to honor them. On May 12, just 4 days after victory celebrations in Europe, Churchill warned President Harry Truman that an Iron Curtain was coming down across the Soviet front. He feared that once American troops withdrew from parts of Germany and began leaving Europe, the West would lose the one thing it still possessed: military leverage. That fear was the hidden reason behind what came next. Churchill's first objective was not to conquer the Russian people. He was not pretending that Britain, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, could casually begin another massive war. He knew the Soviet Union had carried an enormous share of the fighting against Germany, but he believed the final position of the armies could decide the political future of Europe for decades. If the Western Allies demobilized first, Stalin could shape Poland and Eastern Europe without facing serious pressure. Diplomatic protests might be ignored. Agreements signed at conferences might become empty words. The war would have ended with Hitler defeated, but millions of people would still live under governments they had not freely chosen. To Churchill, that was not a clean victory. It was a warning. The question he placed before British military planners was brutal in its simplicity. Could force, or the believable threat of force, make the Soviet Union give Poland a fair deal? Even asking that question was dangerous. The British public had no desire to fight another ally. American support was uncertain. The Soviet army was battle-hardened, enormous, and positioned across the very ground where a new war would begin. A single miscalculation could turn the celebration of 1945 into the opening chapter of a Third World War. That is why the work was kept secret. Normal military staffs were not fully consulted. The study was handled by a small circle of planners who were asked to examine a possibility that almost no one outside the highest levels of government could imagine. If WWII decisions like this pull you in, stay with me, because the plan they produced was even more dangerous than the question. The planners were told to assume that Britain and the United States had public support, that Polish forces would assist them, and that even German manpower might be used. They were also given a date so shocking that it made the entire study feel less like theory and more like a countdown, July 1945. Less than 2 months after Germany's surrender, British and American troops might be ordered to turn east and attack the army that had just helped them win the war. The secret plan needed a name. The name chosen was Operation Unthinkable. The name sounded dramatic, but the first pages of Operation Unthinkable were colder than any speech Churchill could have given. They were a list of assumptions. Before the planners could decide whether the Soviet Union might be forced to change, of course, they had to build a world in which the attack had any chance at all, and almost every assumption revealed how fragile the idea really was. First, the British Empire and the United States would have to support the war completely, not quietly, not with hesitation. Public opinion would need to remain strong, and British and American troops would need to believe that fighting the Red Army was necessary. For years, Allied newspapers had praised Soviet resistance against Hitler. Western soldiers had watched the Red Army tear into Germany from the east while they advanced from the west. Families were waiting for sons, husbands, and fathers to come home. Many troops believed the war in Europe was finished. Now those same men might be told that yesterday's ally had become tomorrow's enemy. The planners could not calculate morale with the same confidence as tanks or aircraft. But they understood that an army ordered into a new war without public support could lose its strength before the first major battle. The second assumption was explosive. Polish forces would fully support Britain and the United States. The Western Allies could also count on German manpower and what remained of German industry. Only weeks earlier, British, American, Polish, and Soviet soldiers had all been fighting Nazi Germany. Now, a secret British study was forced to consider using German resources against the Soviet Union. That did not mean Churchill had decided to rebuild Hitler's army or restore the Nazi state. Germany had surrendered, and the Nazi regime was being destroyed. But the military problem was so severe that the planners could not ignore the millions of defeated German soldiers, the surviving factories, and the weapons scattered across Europe. The idea showed just how quickly the map had changed. A German soldier who had been an enemy in April might, in theory, become useful against the Red Army in July. For Polish troops, the situation would have been bitter beyond words. Poland had been invaded by Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Polish citizens had suffered terribly under both occupations. Now Polish forces might be asked to fight beside Western armies using the manpower of the country that had helped destroy their homeland. The planners also assumed that other Western European nations would provide bases and facilities, even if their armies did not join the fighting. They assumed the Soviet Union would ally itself with Japan, and they assumed that troop releases and redeployments would continue only until July 1, then stop. Every day after Germany's surrender, Western military strength in Europe was beginning to drain away. American forces were needed in the Pacific. Soldiers were being prepared for new duties or sent home. Equipment would be moved, units reduced, and wartime momentum lost. If Churchill wanted military pressure to influence Stalin, the opportunity would not remain open for long. But the planners were not asked only whether the Allies could win a battle. They were forced to define what victory would even mean. The political goal was described in blunt language: to impose the will of the United States and the British Empire upon the Soviet Union. That will might mean nothing more than a fair settlement for Poland. But the report immediately warned that a limited political demand did not guarantee a limited war. That was the trap at the center of the entire plan. The Western Allies might strike Soviet forces, gain ground, and hope Stalin backed down. But Stalin would decide whether to accept the blow or answer with everything the Soviet Union possessed. No British planner could promise that a short attack would remain short. A fight for Poland could become a total war. And total war against the Soviet Union was not like defeating a smaller European power. Germany had already discovered that. In 1941, Hitler's armies had driven deep into Soviet territory. They reached the region around Moscow, pushed toward the Volga, and fought toward the Caucasus. Yet the Soviet Union continued to resist. Factories were moved east. New resources were developed. More soldiers entered the fight. Even if Western forces defeated Soviet armies in Central Europe, the Red Army might withdraw instead of collapsing. The war could move across enormous distances, farther and farther from Western supply lines. Capturing land would not automatically destroy Soviet power. To force a lasting result, the Allies might have to occupy enough of the Soviet Union to make continued resistance impossible, or defeat its armies so completely that they could no longer fight. In Central Europe, the planners estimated that Soviet forces held a strength advantage of roughly 3-1. They did not dismiss the Red Army as a crude mass. They recognized that Soviet commanders were experienced, the equipment was adequate, and the organization had survived the harshest test imaginable. The Western Allies had advantages. Their organization was stronger, their equipment was often better. Their forces had mobility, air power, and a powerful supply system. But advantages were not the same as victory. The Red Army had just fought all the way to Berlin. It had taken terrible losses and kept moving. Its soldiers were already positioned across the ground where the new war would begin. It did not need to cross the English Channel or rebuild a front from nothing. The planners reached a conclusion that exposed the true danger behind Churchill's question. A quick success might be possible in theory. A lasting success would require the defeat of the Soviet Union in a total war, and a total war could take a long time. So before a single route of advance was chosen, Operation Unthinkable had begun to answer itself. The problem was not only how to attack, the problem was how to stop. The most dangerous part of Operation Unthinkable was not the idea of beginning a new war. It was the belief that the war might be ended quickly. In the summer of 1945, the Western Allies still possessed one of the most powerful military machines ever assembled. American and British armies had crossed France, broken through Germany, and reached the Elbe. Their aircraft had crushed much of the Luftwaffe. Their navies controlled the seas. Their supply system could move fuel, food, ammunition, and replacement parts across an entire continent. To anyone looking only at the victory over Hitler, the temptation was obvious. Strike hard, use surprise, push the Red Army back. Make Stalin believe that holding Poland was not worth the cost. But the map did not offer an easy path. The planners did not imagine a reckless march straight toward Moscow. The first phase would be fought across Germany and Western Poland, where Soviet and Western armies already stood within reach of one another. As many as 47 British and American divisions would be committed to the opening attack, supported by Polish forces. One major thrust would move along the northern German coast toward Stettin, the important Baltic port now known as Szczecin. Western naval power might protect the northern flank, while amphibious landings could help the advance move around Soviet positions. A second major thrust would drive east on an axis running from Leipzig through Cottbus, then toward Poznan and Breslau. The goal was not simply to capture cities. The planners wanted to force a decisive battle before the Soviets could trade space for time. If the fighting went well, Western armies might reach a line running roughly from Danzig on the Baltic coast to Breslau in the south. That line mattered because every mile beyond it made the problem worse. The front would grow longer. Supply lines would stretch deeper into territory damaged by 6 years of war. Soviet forces in and around Bohemia and Moravia would create a dangerous position on the Allied flank. Winter would be approaching. And if the Red Army had not suffered a crushing defeat by then, the limited campaign would begin to disappear. The Allies would no longer be fighting for a quick political result. They would be fighting a total war. That was exactly the kind of war the Soviet Union had already proved it could survive. The Western Allies had important strengths. Their command systems were efficient, their armored units were mobile, their strategic bomber forces were far larger than the Soviet Union's. At sea, Britain and the United States held overwhelming power. But the battlefield in Central Europe would be decided first by soldiers, tanks, artillery, and tactical aircraft. In those categories, the numbers were frightening. The British staff estimated that the Soviet Union would possess well over twice as many divisions as the Western Allies in the wider European theater. Soviet infantry strength was especially heavy. The Red Air Force also had far more tactical aircraft available for direct support of troops on the ground. The Red Army was not the same force that had been shocked by the German invasion in 1941. By 1945, it had learned through 4 years of brutal combat. Its commanders knew how to hide reserves, concentrate artillery, build defenses, and launch armored counterattacks. Its troops had crossed rivers, surrounded German armies, and fought through cities all the way to Berlin. The planners believed Soviet armored formations might be held back from the first blow, then thrown against any Western breakthrough east of the Oder and Neisse rivers. That meant the attack could appear successful at first. Western forces might break through forward positions. They might advance across ground that the Soviets were willing to give up. They might believe the plan was working. Then the Soviet reserves could arrive. The battle that followed would decide far more than a few miles of territory. It could decide whether the Western armies remained an attacking force or became trapped in a long struggle against a larger enemy. There was another problem hidden inside the word surprise. For the attack to have any chance, the Soviet command could not be given time to prepare. Yet the British and American public would need to be convinced that a new war was necessary. Soldiers would need to understand why they were being ordered to attack men who had been called allies only weeks earlier. Governments would need to explain why victory celebrations had suddenly turned into another call for sacrifice. Public preparation could warrant Stalin. No public preparation could weaken morale. The plan needed secrecy and support at the same time, and those two needs pulled in opposite directions. Later generations often imagined that the United States could have solved the problem with the atomic bomb. But on the planned opening date of July 1, 1945, no nuclear weapon had ever been tested. The Trinity test in New Mexico was still 15 days away. Japan was still fighting, and American forces were still preparing for what many feared would be a costly final campaign in the Pacific. There was no proven atomic shortcut waiting to rescue Operation Unthinkable. There was only a conventional battlefield filled with millions of experienced soldiers, thousands of tanks, and commanders who had spent years learning how to destroy entire armies. The deeper the planners looked, the clearer the danger became. Their offensive depended on a surprise blow against a stronger land force. It depended on a decisive victory before winter. It depended on Stalin choosing to negotiate after being attacked. And it depended on the United States remaining fully committed even while the war against Japan continued. If any one of those conditions failed, the West could be pulled into a conflict it had not prepared its people to fight and could not easily bring to an end. The planners had been asked how Britain might force the Soviet Union to give Poland a fair deal. Their answer was beginning to sound like a warning to Britain itself, because once the first Allied tanks moved east, Churchill would no longer control the size of the war. Stalin would. By the time the planners reached their conclusion, Operation Unthinkable had stopped looking like a plan for victory. It looked like a warning. The first hope had been simple. A sudden Western attack might shock the Soviet leadership, break part of the Red Army's front, and convince Stalin that controlling Poland was not worth the risk of a larger war. But military plans do not survive on hope. They survive only if the enemy behaves as expected, and nothing required Stalin to behave as Churchill wanted. If Soviet forces refused to retreat, the Western Allies would have to keep advancing. If the Red Army withdrew without being destroyed, it could rebuild farther east. If the Soviet government decided to continue the war, Britain and the United States could not force a quick ending merely by capturing a line on a map. The Joint Planning Staff stated the problem clearly. To achieve the political goal with certainty and lasting results, the Soviet Union would have to be defeated in a total war. That conclusion changed everything. A total war would not be a short punishment designed to improve a diplomatic bargain. It would be a struggle against a country with enormous territory, deep manpower reserves, and an army already spread across Eastern Europe. The planners could not predict the result. The one thing they believed was certain was that winning would take a very long time. Britain did not have a very long time. The country had been at war for nearly 6 years. Its cities had been bombed. Its economy was strained. Its people had lived with rationing, separation, and loss. British forces were still committed around the world, and the war against Japan had not yet ended. The United States was even more important to the plan than Britain. American troops, aircraft, equipment, fuel, and industrial power would carry much of any new conflict, yet the United States had its own war to finish in the Pacific. Churchill could ask for American support, but he could not order it. Inside Operation Unthinkable, full American support appeared as an assumption. Outside the document, it was a question. That gap was fatal. Churchill understood that military leverage was fading by the day. Every American unit sent toward the Pacific Every British formation reduced, and every soldier released from service made a future confrontation harder. In his mind, delay was not neutral. Delay allowed Soviet control to become normal, permanent, and much more difficult to challenge. Yet speed created its own danger. There was no time to prepare the alliance, explain the new threat to the public, or rebuild a common purpose after Germany's defeat. The Western Allies had won in Europe because they had built overwhelming power over years. They had prepared armies, ships, aircraft, supply lines, and public support for the defeat of Nazi Germany. The war against the Soviet Union would begin with none of that political preparation, and with much of the public believing peace had finally arrived. Even the best possible opening result would not solve the deeper problem. Suppose British, American, and Polish forces struck on July 1. Suppose surprise worked. Suppose Soviet units were pushed back and Western armies gained ground. The military power of the Soviet Union would still exist. Stalin could accept terms for the moment, then wait until the Western armies weakened or divided. A battlefield success might create a pause. It could not guarantee peace. The planners also warned that fighting could not be limited to one part of Europe. Once hostilities began, the Allies would have to expect a worldwide struggle. The Soviet Union would choose where and how to respond. The Western powers might control the oceans, but their interests, bases, and allies stretched across a vast map. A war begun over Poland could spread far beyond Poland. That meant every limited objective carried an unlimited risk. The British chiefs of staff had to decide whether the danger was worth it. Their answer was grim. A quick but limited success was beyond Allied power, and the attack could commit them to a protracted war against heavy odds. This was not the answer Churchill wanted, but it was the answer he had asked his military advisors to give. Operation Unthinkable was not an order to begin World War III. It was a secret test of whether force could still change the political map of Europe. The test showed that Britain's military strength, impressive as it was, could not guarantee the political result Churchill wanted. The hidden reason Churchill had considered invasion was now fully exposed. He feared that once Western armies demobilized, the promises made to Poland would become almost impossible to enforce. He feared that Soviet military control would harden into political control, and he feared that the balance of power created in 1945 might last for generations. Yet, the plan also proved something Churchill could not escape. Trying to prevent Soviet domination by launching a new war might destroy the Europe he wanted to save. There would be no clean strike, no simple retreat, and no safe line where the fighting could be stopped. The Allies could begin the war, but they could not decide how large it became or how long it lasted, so the offensive version of Operation Unthinkable collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. The soldiers remained where they were. The tanks did not turn east. The date of July 1 passed without the opening of another European war. But Churchill's fear did not disappear with the offensive plan. It grew darker. If the Western Allies could not force the Red Army out of Eastern Europe, what would happen if the Red Army moved farther west? What would happen when American divisions left the continent, British forces shrank, and the Soviet Union stood stronger than any land power Europe had ever seen? The question inside the planning rooms changed. It was no longer, can we attack? It was, can we survive if they do? Churchill never gave the order. On July 1, 1945, the guns did not open. British and American tanks did not turn east. Soviet soldiers did not wake to find that their wartime allies had become their enemies. Operation Unthinkable remained a plan on paper, but the paper had already changed the way British leaders saw the peace. The military staff had answered Churchill's question with a warning. The Western Allies might begin a war against the Soviet Union, but they could not control how it ended. They could not guarantee a quick victory. They could not be sure the United States would commit itself fully, and they could not promise the British people that another terrible war would remain limited. The price of forcing Stalin out of Poland might be the destruction of Europe. That made the offensive too dangerous to use. Yet Churchill did not suddenly believe that the danger in Eastern Europe had disappeared. The same secret planning file moved toward a different problem. Instead of asking how the Western Allies might attack Soviet forces, British planners considered the risk of Soviet aggression and the defense of the West. The direction of fear had reversed. This shift revealed the deepest meaning of Operation Unthinkable. Churchill was not simply searching for a new enemy after Hitler's defeat. He was trying to understand what military power still meant in a world where the wartime alliance was already breaking apart. The Soviet view also had its own hard logic. Russia had been invaded from the west more than once, and the German invasion had caused destruction on a scale few countries could imagine. Stalin wanted friendly governments along the Soviet border so that no future enemy could use Eastern Europe as a road toward Moscow. But to the people of Poland and other nations in the region, a Soviet security zone could feel like the loss of their own freedom. That was the conflict Churchill could not solve. He believed Britain had fought the war to defend the right of smaller nations to survive without being controlled by stronger ones. Poland had been the first great test of that promise. Polish forces had fought beside Britain even after their homeland was occupied. Now, at the moment of victory, the future of Poland depended far more on the Red Army standing inside the country than on agreements signed by the Allied leaders. Churchill understood an uncomfortable truth. In international politics, promises are often strongest when military power stands behind them. By the summer of 1945, Soviet power stood in Poland. British power did not. Churchill carried his concern into the Potsdam Conference, where the leaders of the victorious powers met outside Berlin in July. The official agreement again spoke of free and unfettered elections in Poland. On paper, the promise remained alive. Then British politics delivered its own surprise. The general election result removed Churchill from office. He had led Britain through its darkest wartime years, but he did not remain prime minister to shape the first months of peace. Clement Attlee returned to Potsdam in his place. The change of leader did not erase the larger problem. The wartime alliance continued to weaken. Soviet influence spread across Eastern Europe. The political divide that Churchill had feared became one of the defining facts of the post-war world. Less than a year after Germany's defeat, Churchill described an iron curtain descending across the continent. He was no longer speaking from the Prime Minister's office, and he was not announcing an invasion. He was warning that Europe had been divided while much of the world was still celebrating peace. The Cold War did not begin because Operation Unthinkable existed. The plan was a symptom of a deeper break between former allies who had defeated the same enemy but wanted very different futures. The United States and Britain saw political choice, open elections, and access to Europe as essential to a stable peace. Stalin saw control of the Soviet Union's Western approaches as essential to security. Between those positions stood countries whose people had already suffered occupation, invasion, and war. Operation Unthinkable showed how close the logic of fear could bring the victors to another disaster. It also showed why Churchill's idea must be described carefully. He did not launch an invasion of the Soviet Union. He did not receive a military plan that promised victory and then lose his nerve. His advisors told him that a limited attack could become a total war, that the Soviet Union could not be forced into a lasting settlement quickly, and that the risk was beyond Allied power. Churchill listened. That decision mattered. Europe had barely survived the war against Nazi Germany. A new conflict in July 1945 would have placed millions of soldiers back into battle before the dead had even been buried. Cities already reduced to rubble could have become battlefields again. Poland, the country Churchill wanted to help, might have been destroyed once more between great armies. The plan's failure was not proof that Churchill's fear was foolish. The decades that followed showed that the division of Europe was real. Eastern and Western Europe developed under opposing systems, backed by rival military powers. The line between them became one of the most dangerous borders in the world. But the fact that Churchill feared this future did not mean war was the right answer. That is the final tension at the heart of Operation Unthinkable. Churchill wanted leverage before the West's armies went home. He wanted Stalin to believe that agreements over Poland could not be ignored without consequence. He wanted to prevent a temporary military occupation from becoming a permanent political order. Yet the only military tool powerful enough to force that result could have started a war. No one knew how to stop. So Operation Unthinkable stayed hidden, not because it was unimportant, but because it exposed a truth too dangerous for the victory celebrations of one. 945. The Allies had defeated Hitler together. They had not agreed on what freedom in Europe would look like after he was gone. And that was the hidden reason Churchill asked his planners to consider the unthinkable. He feared the war had been won in Berlin but lost in Warsaw.